3 men went down into the Harlan silver mine on the morning of October 14, 1911, and did not come back up. The 2 who followed them in search of answers came back changed in ways they could never fully explain. I was one of those 2 men, and I have spent 53 years deciding whether to speak about what we found in the dark beneath the Humboldt Range. My name is Walter Eben Krause. I was born in 1878 in Elko County, Nevada, the son of a cattle rancher who lost his land to drought when I was 11 years old. By the time I was 17, I had worked fence lines, railroad grades, and flour mills across 3 states. I found my way into mining the way most men did in those years, not by choice exactly, but by the pull of wages and the absence of better options. I had a strong back, a steady temperament, and no fear of enclosed spaces. These qualities made me useful underground. By 1905, I had worked 7 different operations across Nevada and Utah and had risen to the position of shift foreman at the Vance Colton copper operation near Winnemucca. I was methodical. I kept clean records. I did not drink during working weeks. These habits eventually brought me to the attention of a company representative named Edmund Harlan, who was quietly assembling a team to oversee extraction operations at a newly leased silver property east of Lovelock, in a dry fold of the Humboldt Mountains that the local Paiute people had referred to for generations by a name that translated loosely as the place where the ground remembers. I did not learn that translation until much later. At the time, I simply knew the site as Harlan No. 1. The year was 1911. I was 33 years old. I believed, as most men of my generation believed, that the earth was a resource to be worked and that the dark beneath it held nothing more dangerous than gas pockets, bad timber, and the occasional collapse. I understood mining as a mechanical problem. Ore went in one direction, men went in another. You managed the variables and you kept your crew alive, and you went home at the end of the season with money in your pocket. I'd done this successfully for nearly 15 years. I was not a superstitious man. I was not a man given to imagination or to the kind of internal theater that produces visions and disturbances. I want to make that clear at the outset, because the account I'm about to give would seem to require a particular kind of mind. And I am telling you that my mind was not that kind. What I experienced at Harlan No. 1 was not the product of an overwrought temperament. It happened exactly as I will describe it, and the records that survived the company's disposal efforts will confirm at least the outline of what I say, if anyone still knows where to look for them. I arrived at the Harlan site in the first week of August, 1911. The approach road came up through a long gravel wash between 2 parallel ridges of pale volcanic rock, the kind of terrain that absorbs heat during the day and releases it slowly through the night, so that even in the small hours of the morning, the ground itself seems to breathe warmth against your ankles. The camp had been established perhaps 6 weeks before my arrival. There were 14 structures in total, including a cookhouse, an assay building, a company office, a tool depot, a powder magazine set apart from the others at a distance of 200 yards, and 9 sleeping structures that held between 4 and 6 men each. The water supply came from a spring-fed tank serviced twice weekly by a supply wagon from Lovelock. The terrain was high desert, scrub and sage and pale caliche soil cut through by the black vertical seam of the mine entrance like a wound in the hillside. The air at that elevation, approximately 5,400 feet, carried a particular dryness that made the inside of your nose feel papery within the first hour of arrival. There were 41 men working the site when I took over as day shift foreman. My predecessor, a man named George Finch, had left the operation 2 weeks prior after submitting a brief written notice citing personal reasons. I was told this was not unusual. The work was isolated, and the pay, while adequate, was not generous. Men came and went from remote operations for any number of reasons. I did not give George Finch or his departure any particular thought in those first weeks. The mine itself had been sunk into a natural upthrust of quartzite and rhyolite that the company geologists believed held a productive silver-bearing vein at depth. The main shaft descended at a shallow angle for the first 60 feet before leveling into a drift that ran roughly southeast. Off this primary drift, 2 lateral crosscuts had been opened by the time of my arrival, and each extending approximately 40 feet before terminating in working faces where the drilling crews were advancing daily. The rock was moderately hard, the ventilation adequate, and the timbering sound. In my professional judgment, upon first inspection, it was an unremarkable operation. I noted some unusual formation in the deeper sections of the main drift, a quality of the rock that was not quite consistent with the surrounding geology. Sections of the tunnel wall that seemed too smooth, as though worked by something finer than a drill or a pick. I attributed this to natural weathering processes and did not document it in my initial assessment. I wish now that I had. My first weeks at Harlan No. 1 were occupied entirely with routine management. I learned the names and habits of my crew, and I assessed the timbering at several points that looked marginal to me and had them reinforced. I reviewed the blasting schedule with the powder man, a quiet Finnish immigrant named Thomas Virkkunen, who had been with the operation since its opening. I established a system for tracking daily footage advanced in each working face, a practice that allowed me to monitor productivity and to catch any anomalies in the pattern of work. I was thorough, and I was content. The work was steady, and the weather in those first weeks was clear and hot in the way that Nevada in August is reliably clear and hot. No surprises, no complications. The first thing I noticed, the very first thing that lodged itself somewhere in the back of my awareness without yet announcing itself as significant, was the silence. Not the silence underground, which in any mine is a specific and familiar thing, a pressure against the ears that the brain quickly learns to fill with the sounds of breathing and footfall and the distant percussion of drilling. No, the silence I mean was the silence of the surrounding terrain. I had worked remote sites before and understood that desert environments support a particular kind of wildlife, lizards and rodents, and the occasional hawk or buzzard overhead. Creatures whose habits produce a steady, low register of ambient sound. The wash below the camp had the look of ground that should have harbored rabbits and possibly coyote. There were sagebrush stands along the lower ridges that I would have expected to see birds moving through in the early morning. But from my first days at the site, I noticed that the sounds I expected were simply absent. The mornings were extraordinarily quiet, the evenings likewise. The cook's dog, a broad-chested brown animal named Duster who had been on site since the operation began, spent his nights inside the cookhouse rather than ranging freely as dogs at campsites typically do, and the cook explained this by saying simply that Duster did not like the dark here. I thought this was an amusing way to describe an animal's behavior and did not examine the explanation further. It was during the 3rd week of August that I first heard what the men called the echo. I was making a routine inspection of the lower drift with my lamp turned to its highest wick setting. I had reached the terminus of the primary drift, approximately 220 feet from the shaft entrance, where the working face sat quiet between shifts. I was examining a section of drill hole placement and making notes in my field book when I heard my own voice. Not at the moment of speaking, I should clarify. I heard words I'd spoken perhaps 10 minutes earlier while giving instruction to a trammer at the shaft entrance, repeated back to me from the darkness ahead. The words were, "Make sure that cart is properly seated before you haul it up." These were not unusual words. They were the kind of operational instruction a foreman gives dozens of times across a shift, but they came back to me there in the dark, at the end of that tunnel, in what I can only describe as a voice that was my own, but not quite right. The rhythm was slightly different. The vowels carried a quality that my voice does not carry, and a depth or resonance that I could not account for by any ordinary acoustic explanation. I stood very still for a moment. I examined the drift wall ahead of me. The working face was solid rock, drilled and ready for the next blast cycle, with no gaps or openings visible by lantern light. I walked the last 12 feet to the face and put my hand against it. Solid. I put my ear against it. Nothing. I told myself it was an acoustic phenomenon, sound traveling strangely through the rock, some quality of the tunnel geometry that had bounced my earlier words back to me with a delay. I'd worked enough underground to know that tunnels could produce strange effects. I noted it briefly in my log under the heading Acoustic Anomaly, First Occurrence, Primary Drift Terminus, August 22nd, 1911, and I thought no more about it that evening. But I began, and from that night forward, to pay closer attention to the quality of sound in the tunnels. The second occurrence was reported to me by a miner named Chet Aldro, a stocky man from Colorado who had been working at the site for 3 months before my arrival. Aldro came to my office on the morning of August 25th and sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk and told me that the tunnel had spoken to him. He used exactly that phrase and then looked immediately embarrassed by it. He clarified that he had heard his own words repeated back to him in the lower section of crosscut 2 in the deepest part of the working face, and that the repetition had occurred perhaps 20 minutes after he had spoken the original words. The words in question were something Aldro had said to a fellow miner about the density of the rock changing character near the face. Something along the lines of "this formation feels different to me, like it does not want to be here." He had spoken these words idly, not particularly directing them to anyone, and had thought nothing of them until they came back to him from the direction of the sealed rock ahead, 20 minutes later, in what he described as his own voice, but slower. I wrote down Aldro's account. I told him I had experienced something similar, and that I believed it was an acoustic phenomenon related to the tunnel geometry. I told him I would investigate and that he should not discuss it with the other men until I had something concrete to report. Aldro agreed to this and went back to work, and I noted his account in the log alongside my own. 2 occurrences in 4 days, both in the deepest sections of the workings, both involving delayed playback of previously spoken words. I was not yet alarmed. I was curious and perhaps a little unsettled in a way I was not ready to examine directly. But I was not alarmed. Over the following week, I made a point of moving through the deepest sections of the mine alone, at different hours, speaking words aloud and then remaining silent and still to document whether and when those words returned. On 3 separate occasions during this period, I heard my own voice come back to me from the direction of the sealed working faces. The delays ranged from 8 minutes to slightly over half an hour. The repetitions were not perfect. As I noted above, so the rhythm and the vowel quality were subtly altered. In one case, on the evening of August 29th, a phrase I had spoken, the phrase was simply testing, 1, 2, 3, came back to me not as testing, 1, 2, 3, but as something closer to listening, 1, 2, 3. I sat with that for a long moment in the dark, before I convinced myself that the acoustic distortion was responsible for the change, that my ear was reading meaning into phonetic variation, that I was doing what the mind does in ambiguous circumstances, which is pattern match and impose sense where sense may not exist. I was not entirely convinced by my own reasoning, but I documented it as distortion, and I went back to work. The 3rd week of September brought a change in the character of the phenomenon that I could no longer categorize as purely acoustic. Thomas Virkanen, the powder man, came to me on the morning of September the 17th. He was not a man who came to me with complaints. In the 6 weeks I had known him, he had been efficient and quiet, and had never once raised a concern that was not directly operational. So when he knocked on my office door and stood in the frame with a particular set to his face that I had not seen on him before, I put down my pen immediately. He told me that the previous evening, during the last hour of his shift, he had been preparing the blast holes in crosscut 2 for the following morning's charge. He was working alone, which was standard practice during the final preparation stage. He had spoken aloud to himself as he worked, as men who work alone often do, running through his checklist verbally, talking himself through the placement sequence. And he had said at one point, working through a calculation about charge weight relative to the hardness of the formation ahead, something to the effect of this rock is going to need more than we gave it last time. He had then been quiet for several minutes as he worked, and then, from the direction of the working face, in a voice that he described as resembling his own but carrying a register he could not quite identify, he heard not a repetition of what he had said, but a response. The words he heard were, "It has been more than you know." He told me this standing in my office doorway with the morning light behind him and his hat in both hands, and I watched his face as he said it, and I believed him completely without wanting to believe him. I sat with him for a long time that morning, and I asked him to describe the voice in as much detail as he could. He said it was his own voice in the sense that the basic timbre was recognizable as similar to his own, but that it had a quality he struggled to name, something he finally described as depth without distance. He said it did not sound like a voice coming from far away. It sounded like a voice coming from very nearby, but from somewhere deeper than any physical nearby. He was quiet after he said this, clearly aware of how the description sounded, and I told him that I took his account seriously and that I was going to be spending more time in the deep workings over the next several days to conduct my own observations. After he left, I sat for a long while at my desk looking at my field log. The entries up to that point showed 4 acoustic anomaly incidents, all in the deepest sections of the mine, all involving human speech. 3 had involved straightforward though distorted repetition. 1, Virkanen's account, had involved what appeared to be a responsive statement rather than a repetition. I drew a line in the log under the last entry and wrote beneath it, "Pattern shift, September 17th, 1911. I did not write what I was thinking. What I was thinking was that the difference between repetition and response was significant in a way I did not have language for yet. A tunnel that echoes is a geological fact. A tunnel that responds to speech is something else entirely. The behavioral changes among the crew began subtly in the last week of September. I noticed first that the men in the deepest working sections had begun speaking less during their shifts. Mining crews are not by nature quiet, and there is a constant low level of verbal exchange underground, instructions and observations and the ordinary social currency of men working in proximity to one another. In the lower sections of Harlan No. 1, this normal pattern of speech had attenuated. Men still spoke when they needed to, but the idle talk, the asides and observations and casual conversation had fallen away. I observed this across several shifts before I understood what I was seeing. The men had, without discussion or instruction, adopted a policy of speaking as little as possible in the deep workings. They had done this individually, each arriving at the same conclusion on his own, and because none of them wanted to articulate why, none of them had spoken about it. When I raised the subject with my shift supervisor, a capable man named Roland Pruitt, who had been underground for 20 years, he looked at me for a moment before answering and then said, "Nobody wants to give it more to work with." I asked him what he meant by that. He said, "Whatever is down there, it uses what we say. If we stop saying things, maybe it stops having things to use." I asked him when he had arrived at this conclusion. He said, "About 3 weeks ago, when it started finishing sentences." This was news to me, and concerning news. I had documented the single incident of apparent response from Virkanen, but I had not been told of any sentence completion events. Pruitt told me then that several men, including himself, had experienced incidents in which a half-formed thought spoken aloud had been completed from the direction of the working face before the speaker had finished saying it. The completions were not always accurate, he said. Sometimes they were nonsensical. Sometimes they were accurate in a way that was worse than the nonsensical completions, because an accurate completion meant that whatever was down there had a correct model of what you were about to say before you said it. I sent Pruitt back to his shift, and I sat with this new information for the rest of that afternoon. By the end of September, I'd made a decision that I did not fully understand at the time, but that I believe, in retrospect, was the right one. I began keeping a second log. The official log, the one I submitted to the company representative each week, documented footage advanced, blast cycles completed, timber used, and equipment conditions. The second log, which I kept in a personal field book separate from company property, documented everything I was observing and hearing about the phenomenon in the deep workings. I intended this second log as a record for my own clarity, a way of organizing observations that I could not yet explain. I did not know at the time that it would eventually become the primary source for the account I am now giving. The entries in that second log from late September and early October of 1911 make for difficult reading, even now. Not because they are sensational. They are not. They are written in the same flat methodical style I used for everything because that was how my mind worked and still works. But the progression they document is, hence when I read them in sequence, deeply unsettling in a way that the individual incidents, taken one at a time, had allowed me to minimize. The first week of October brought colder weather. The nights dropped below freezing early in the month, and the mornings carried a hard clarity that was different from the dry heat of August and September. The change in temperature affected the mine as well, with the air in the upper sections carrying a chill that was not present in the deeper workings, where the ground maintained its own warmth independent of the surface conditions. This thermal inversion was normal and expected. But in the deeper sections of the mine, in Crosscut 2 and the lower portion of the primary drift, the warmth in the first week of October had increased. Not dramatically, but measurably. The rock face in the deepest section of Crosscut 2 registered noticeably warm to the touch by the 4th of October. Warm enough that Virkanen noted it when he went to prepare the morning blast. Warm in the way that rock sometimes feels warm when there is water moving through it at depth, except that there was no water in those workings. The geology did not support a water table at that elevation. There was no explanation for it that fit within the framework of what I knew. I noted it in the second log. Rock temperature elevated at Crosscut 2 terminus, October 4th, 1911. No geological explanation consistent with known formation. On the morning of October 6th, a miner named Dolph Ressner came up from the deep shift at the end of his rotation and told me he had seen a shadow move in the section of the primary drift between the first timber set and the entrance to Crosscut 2. He was specific about the location. He said the shadow had moved in a direction contrary to his lamp, meaning that it had not been cast by his own light, but had moved independently of any light source. He described it as large, larger than a man's shadow, and as moving with a deliberate, slow quality that he could not explain. He said it had appeared for perhaps 3 seconds and then was gone. He said it did not move the way a shadow moves when a lamp is shifted. It moved the way something moves when it is walking. Ressner was not an imaginative man. He was built along the lines of a man who does not waste effort on things that cannot be quantified, and his face, when he reported this to me, held the particular expression of someone describing an event that they wish had not occurred. I wrote down his account in full and told him to say nothing to the others. The shadow was seen again on the 7th by a different miner, a young man named Percy Tull, who had been on site only 5 weeks and who was, of all the crew, the least likely to have been influenced by accumulated rumor because he had been told nothing of the preceding incidents. Percy Tull came to me unsolicited and described a shadow in exactly the same section of the primary drift that Ressner had identified, with the same characteristics of scale and movement. He said it had appeared for a brief interval and then was gone. And he said he had stood very still and watched the spot where it had disappeared, and that after perhaps a minute of silence, from deep in the tunnel, he had heard his own name spoken. Not by a voice he recognized, not by any voice that sounded human exactly. By something that had learned the sound of human speech well enough to assemble a name from it, in the same way that a skilled mimic assembles sounds without necessarily understanding their meaning. He said the voice that spoke his name had his own vocal quality, which was what made it worst, because it meant that whatever had spoken it had been listening to him long enough to build a working model of how he sounded. That evening, I descended into the mine alone. I want to be careful here about what I describe, because the temptation when speaking about what I experienced in those tunnels is to reach for language that exceeds what I can honestly claim to know. I am not a man who deals in the supernatural as a category. I am a man who deals in what I can observe and what I can document. What I observed and documented on the evening of October 7th, 1911, in the lower sections of the Harlan No. 1 mine, I will tell you as exactly as I told it in my field log that night, by lamplight, while the tunnel was still around me and the silence had the particular weight that I was by then thoroughly familiar with. I descended the main shaft at approximately 8 in the evening, roughly 2 hours after the night shift had come up and before the earliest members of the following day's crew would begin arriving. The mine was entirely empty of human workers. I had confirmed this before descending. I wanted to be alone in the deep workings, not because I was brave or reckless, but because I had reached the point where I needed to encounter the phenomenon directly, without the mediation of another person's account, in order to form a judgment about what it was and what needed to be done about it. I moved through the upper sections of the main drift with my lamp on its highest setting. The air was cool in the upper drift, consistent with the surface temperature. As I moved deeper, passing the first timber sets and approaching the junction with Crosscut 1, I became aware of the warmth increasing around me in the same gradual way that one becomes aware of approaching a fire from a distance. Not unpleasant, simply present, and I noted the warmth and continued. I passed the junction with Crosscut 1 and moved into the section of the primary drift where both Ressner and Tull had reported the shadow. I stopped here and turned my lamp down to its lowest usable setting, which was sufficient to see perhaps 8 feet clearly and another 4 or 5 in diminishing detail. I stood still and breathed quietly and waited. For perhaps 10 minutes, nothing occurred. I could hear the ordinary sounds of the mine under stillness, the faint creak of timber settling, the distant suggestion of water at some unreachable depth, the sound of my own heart working. Then I heard something that was not any of these things. It came from the direction of the Crosscut 2 junction, approximately 30 feet ahead of me and to the left. It was not a voice. Not yet. It was a sound at the lower boundary of what I could identify as sound rather than feeling, a resonance that seemed to come from the rock itself rather than from the air moving through it. It had a rhythm to it, not the rhythm of machinery, the rhythm of something breathing, very slowly, very deliberately. The interval between what I can only describe as inhale and exhale was perhaps 8 seconds. I counted several cycles while I stood motionless in the near dark. I counted 5 complete cycles before the sound changed. What replaced it was silence of a different quality than the ordinary silence of the mine. It was an attentive silence. I understood this the way you understand certain things without being able to fully account for how you understand them. The silence had changed because something had become aware of me, as I stood for a long moment in that attentive silence. Then I spoke. I said my name. Walter Krauss. I said it the way you might say it when introducing yourself to a stranger in an ordinary room, because I could not think of a more appropriate register for the situation, and I had determined before descending that if the tunnel spoke, I would respond to it directly rather than retreating. There was a period of silence after I spoke that lasted perhaps 4 minutes. I tracked it by my watch, holding the face of it close to my lamp. 4 minutes and perhaps 20 seconds. Then from the direction of Crosscut 2, from the deep end of that lateral passage where the working face sat warm against the interior of the mountain, I heard the following. It was not my name. It was not a repetition of what I had said. It was a sound that combined elements of my own voice with something underneath my voice that had a much older quality, like the sound of a voice that has been in the dark for so long that it has forgotten how voices are supposed to work and has built a facsimile from the materials available to it. What it said, or what my mind assembled from the sounds it produced, was, "You came down." And then, after a pause of perhaps 2 seconds, it added, "The others came down too." I do not know how long I stood there before I moved. I know that I eventually brought my lamp up to full height and walked to the entrance of Crosscut 2 and looked down its length to the working face at its end. Nothing was visible in the lamplight. The tunnel was empty of everything I could see. The warmth was distinct here, noticeably so, and it carried a faint smell that I had not been conscious of in earlier visits to this section. I described the smell in my log that night as mineral and old, like the smell inside a very old stone building, like a cathedral basement or an ancient cellar, not the smell of rot or of organic matter, but the smell of very old stone that has been enclosed for a very long time. I did not proceed further into Crosscut 2 that evening. I stood at its entrance for perhaps 5 minutes, watching the darkness beyond the reach of my lamp, and then I turned and walked back through the primary drift and up the shaft and out into the cold Nevada night air. I stood outside the mine entrance for a long time with my lamp still burning and the stars overhead in their immense indifference, and I tried to bring order to what I had just experienced. And I was a foreman responsible for 41 men. I had obligations that did not include standing in the dark, waiting for something ancient to speak to me. But I also had an obligation to those men that was more pressing than any production schedule, and that obligation required me to understand what was in those tunnels before I sent another crew down into them. I wrote in my second log for over an hour that night. I wrote down everything I had experienced in sequence with times and durations recorded as precisely as I could manage. At the end of the entry, I wrote a question that I could not answer. If this thing has been here long enough to build a working model of how human speech sounds, how long has it been listening, and what else has it learned? I slept poorly that night. I dreamed of rock, very old rock with warmth inside it, and the events of the following week moved in a direction that I had not anticipated, but that, in retrospect, followed a logic that I should have seen clearly. On October 9th, a driller named Frank Hassel did not come up at the end of his shift. The shift had gone down at its normal time, 6 in the morning, with 9 men including Hassel. At the end of the 8-hour rotation, 8 men came up. Hassel was not among them. The shift's lead miner, a man named Briggs, told me that Hassel had been working the deep section of Crosscut 2 during the morning, and that the last anyone had seen of him was approximately 2 hours before the shift ended, when Briggs had called down the crosscut to tell Hassel that the blast schedule was being moved to the following morning and that he should clear the face. Briggs said Hassel had called back an acknowledgement. That was the last communication anyone had with Frank Hassel. I organized an immediate search of the working sections. We went through every foot of the mapped tunnels with multiple lamps and called Hassel's name at regular intervals. We found nothing. The Crosscut 2 working face was undisturbed. Hassel's tools were in their place, neatly arranged, his lamp set on its side on the floor near the face. His lamp was cold. It had been out for some time. We searched for 4 hours. We did not find Frank Hassel. I was required to file a report with the company, which I did. The official version attributed Hassel's disappearance to a possible fall in an unlit section of the workings or to a voluntary departure from the site for personal reasons. I filed this report because I had no evidence that contradicted it, and because the alternative, which was to tell a mining company that something in their tunnel had taken one of my men, was not a statement I could substantiate with the kind of evidence that the company would accept. But I knew that Hassel had not fallen and that he had not walked out of the mine for personal reasons. He had been working 60 feet from the most active section of the acoustic phenomenon with his tools still set and his lamp laid carefully on its side, and there was no mapped passage beyond the working face that he could have entered. The working face was solid rock. There was nowhere in the tunnel that Frank Hassel could have gone. I did not sleep on the night of October 9th. On October 11th, 2 more men failed to come up from the deep shift. Their names were Arthur Vane and Carl Dacio. They had been working together in the lower section of the primary drift, in the section between the crosscut 2 junction and the working face of the primary drift, which was by then approximately 40 feet beyond the crosscut. Like Hassel, they had been heard from by other crew members during the shift and had simply not been present when the shift ended. Their tools were found arranged near the primary drift working face, neatly placed in a pattern that the miner who found them described to me as deliberate. He said the tools were arranged in a rough arc facing the working face, like they had been set out as an offering of some kind. I noted this in my second log, and then stood for a long time looking at the described arrangement before I let anyone touch the tools. No lamp was found near Vane and Dacio's tools. I noted this as well. Hassel had left his lamp. Vane and Dacio had not. This was the kind of asymmetry that a rational mind keeps worrying at without being able to explain. By the evening of October 11th, the camp was fully aware that something was wrong. I could not have prevented this even if I'd wanted to. 3 men were missing, and the remaining crew had already begun to construct an explanation from the fragments available to them, the strange voices, the shadows, the warmth in the deep workings, the fact that their shift supervisors had been restricting conversation underground for weeks. By the time I called a full camp meeting at the cookhouse that evening, the mood among the men was not panic, but the thing that precedes panic, a tight, to controlled unease that is in some ways more dangerous because it is deliberate. Panicking men run. Carefully frightened men do things that are not always predictable. I told them as much as I thought was necessary and as little as I thought I could manage. I told them that 3 men were missing and that the cause was unknown. I told them that I was documenting unusual acoustic phenomena in the deep workings that I could not fully explain. I told them that until I had more information, I was suspending all work in the lower sections of the mine, meaning crosscut 2 and the lower 50 feet of the primary drift. Work would continue in the upper sections and in crosscut 1, which had not exhibited any of the phenomena I was investigating. I told them that anyone who wished to leave the site could do so without consequence, and that I would arrange for the supply wagon to carry them to Lovelock at its next scheduled passage. 11 men left on the supply wagon the following morning. That left me with 27 men, including Pruitt and Verkanen. I considered this an adequate crew for the restricted operations I was running. I considered it inadequate for what I was now fairly certain I needed to do, which was conduct a systematic investigation of the deep workings before I could make any responsible recommendation to the company about the future of the site. I spent October 12th reviewing everything I had documented in the second log from the beginning. I read my notes from Aldro's first report through my own solo descent through Verkanen's account of the responsive voice, through the shadow sightings, through the disappearances. I was trying to find the pattern, not in the individual events, but in the sequence of them, in the progression from acoustic repetition to response to shadow to physical contact. Because I was by that point fairly certain that physical contact was what the disappearances represented. Something in those tunnels had taken Frank Hassel and Arthur Vane and Carl Dacio, and I needed to understand what it was and how it operated before I could make any decision about what to do. What I arrived at, after several hours of reading and thinking, was a hypothesis that I was fully aware was not the kind of hypothesis that a rational mining foreman in 1911 was supposed to arrive at. What I arrived at was this. The thing in the tunnels was old. It had been in the rock for a very long time, possibly for a period that made the word old entirely inadequate. It had learned human speech not from any single exposure, but from accumulated exposure, which suggested that the Harlan No. 1 mine was not the first human intrusion into its space. It communicated through a version of human speech because human speech was the only communication medium it had available, not because it thought in human terms, but because it had learned to use human materials. It had taken 3 men, not randomly, but from the deepest accessible sections of the workings, which were the sections closest to whatever part of the formation it occupied. It had not taken men from the upper sections, which suggested either that it did not range far from a central location, or that it was deliberate in the scale of what it took. Taking only from those who came closest to it, it was territorial, it was patient, it had demonstrated that it could anticipate human intention before it was fully expressed. And it was, by every account I had gathered, enormous, or at least its shadow was enormous, which was the only evidence of its physical form that anyone had yet produced. The afternoon of October 12th, I sent a written dispatch to the company representative in Reno via the supply wagon driver. I described the disappearances factually. I described the acoustic phenomena factually. I stated that I believed the deep workings presented a hazard that I could not classify under any existing category of mining risk, and that I was requesting either explicit authorization to conduct a formal investigation of the phenomenon, or explicit instruction to seal the deep workings and suspend operations in those sections indefinitely. I wrote this dispatch carefully, walking the line between what I needed to communicate and what the company would accept as a basis for action. I did not use words that would cause the company to doubt my fitness for my position. I did not say, "There is something ancient in your mountain." I said the deep workings present a hazard of undetermined origin that has resulted in the loss of 3 workers and that requires formal investigation before any further crews are deployed in those sections. The response came back 5 days later. The company authorized a limited investigation and stated that a company representative would arrive within the week to assess the situation. It instructed me to maintain operations in all accessible, unaffected sections. It expressed condolences regarding the missing workers and requested that I complete the standard missing persons documentation at my earliest convenience. It said nothing about sealing any sections. I filed the missing persons documentation. I continued restricted operations in the upper sections. I waited for the company representative, and in the meantime, I made a decision that I did not document in either log and that I did not share with anyone until years after the events at Harlan No. 1 had concluded. I went back into the deep workings alone on the night of October 13th, and I went down at 10 in the evening. The camp was quiet. The temperature had dropped sharply, and there were clouds moving across the stars from the west. I carried 2 lamps and a full canteen and my personal field book. I carried no weapon. A weapon would have been absurd, and I knew it. Whatever was in those tunnels was not going to be addressed with a rifle. I descended the main shaft and moved through the primary drift to the section just short of the Crosscut 2 junction, which was the point at which I had previously stopped. I adjusted both lamps to full height and sat down with my back against the tunnel wall and opened my field book to a clean page. I sat and I breathed and I waited. After a time, perhaps 15 minutes, the warmth became perceptible around me in that gradual way, and not sudden heat, but a slow suffusion of warmth from the rock itself. I spoke. I said, "I know you are here. I am not here to advance the tunnel. I want to understand what happened to the 3 men." The silence after I spoke was different from any silence I'd experienced in the previous descents. It was not the attentive silence of something that has become aware of you. It was the silence of something that has been aware of you for a long time and is considering whether to respond in a new way. If a silence can carry patience, this one did. A patience that made my own patience feel frivolous and temporary. What came back after that silence, after a period that I estimated at roughly 12 minutes, was not voice exactly. It was more than voice. It came from all around me simultaneously, from the rock above and below and on both sides. So not loud, not frightening in its volume, but present in a way that simple sound cannot be. What it produced was not human speech, not even the approximation of human speech that I had heard in earlier encounters. It was a sound that I think was intended as speech, assembled from the components of speech that it had collected, but coming through a medium that was not a human throat and could not perfectly replicate what a human throat produces. What I understood from it, and I want to be very precise here, about the difference between what I heard and what I understood, was something close to the following. It was not a statement. It was not a question. It was something between an observation and a presentation, as though whatever was speaking was showing me something rather than telling me something. And what it showed me, and in the language it had made from my own voice and the voices of everyone who had ever descended into that place, was depth. Not the depth of the mine, the depth of time, of waiting, of something that had existed in the interior of the mountain through a span of time that the word geological barely gestures toward. It showed me what it was like to be inside rock that moved on its own schedule, on a schedule measured not in years or decades or centuries, but in something so vast that human timekeeping had no denominator for it. I sat against that tunnel wall for a very long time. When I finally spoke again, I asked about the three men. I said their names: Frank Hassel, Arthur Vane, Carl Decio. I said them clearly, and I waited. What came back, after a long silence, was the three names, spoken in my own voice, and but with a quality to them that I can only describe as settled. Not dead, not gone in the way that death produces absence. Settled in the rock, part of the depth that the earlier communication had shown me. I sat with this for a while, and I understood that I was not going to retrieve the three men, and that no search party was going to retrieve them, and that the best I could offer the families in the way of explanation was the official company report, because the truth was not something that the structures of 1911 were equipped to receive. I descended once more toward the Crosscut 2 junction as I prepared to leave. Not into the crosscut itself, but to its mouth. I held my lamp at the junction and looked down the full length of the crosscut to the working face at its end. The rock face was warm and faintly luminous in the lamplight in a way that I had not noticed before, or perhaps had not allowed myself to notice before, and at the base of the working face, arranged with great care in a pattern that I did not recognize but that my eye kept trying to read as meaningful, were objects. Not tools, not anything that had been brought down by my crew. They were objects made of stone and arranged in concentric arcs. Small, rounded pieces of stone of different sizes, arranged in a pattern that spiraled inward from the outer arc to a single piece at the center. There were perhaps 200 pieces in total. The arrangement covered perhaps 6 feet of floor space. It was obviously deliberate. It had an obviously deliberate quality that sat in my chest like cold iron. I did not touch the arrangement. And I stood at the crosscut entrance and looked at it for a long time, and then I turned and walked back through the primary drift and up the shaft and out of the mountain. The company representative, a man named Charles Aldgate, arrived on October the 16th. He was a precise and practical man who had been managing remote mining operations for 20 years and who arrived with the air of someone who expected to spend 3 days resolving a personnel dispute. I gave him the official log first and watched him read through it. Then I gave him the second log. He read through that more slowly. His face did not change while he read. When he finished, he put both books on my desk and was quiet for a moment, and then asked me what I thought should be done. I told him the deep workings should be permanently closed, not suspended, not investigated, closed and sealed. I told him that whatever was in the lower sections of the formation had been there for a very long time and had demonstrated that it would defend its space and that no production target was worth what defending it would cost. I told him that the 3 missing men were not recoverable. I told him that I was not a superstitious man and that I was not reporting a ghost story, and that I understood the implications of what I was recommending, both for the company's investment and for my own professional standing. Aldgate looked at me for a long time after I finished. Then he said he wanted to go down himself. I went with him. We descended together to the upper section of the primary drift, well short of the section where the phenomena were concentrated, and we stood there with lamps held high for perhaps 20 minutes while I described the layout of the workings and the progression of events. Nothing occurred during this inspection. No sounds, no warmth, no shadows. The tunnels in the upper sections were simply tunnels, cold and neutral and professional. But as we were preparing to ascend, just as we had turned back toward the shaft, from somewhere deep in the primary drift, from far beyond where I had taken Aldgate, from the direction of the Crosscut 2 junction, there came a sound. Not a voice. Not yet, or not quite. It was the resonance I had described in my October 7th entry, the breathing rhythm of something very large and very old, arriving up the drift like warmth arrives, gradually and from everywhere at once. Aldgate stopped walking, and he turned his head toward the deep section and stood perfectly still with his lamp in his hand. The sound lasted for perhaps 45 seconds and then was gone. The silence after it had the attentive quality I'd come to recognize. Then, from far down in the dark, in a voice built from the fragments of everyone who had ever descended into that mountain, a voice that was my voice and Aldgate's voice and Hassel's voice, and voices I did not recognize, older voices, voices that might have belonged to men who had come before any of us had ever been born. Something said 2 words: go back. We went back. We went up the shaft and out into the cold October air, and we stood outside the mine entrance, and Charles Aldgate, who was a precise and practical man who had managed remote operations for 20 years, did not speak for a long time. But when he spoke, he said, "How quickly can you have this shaft capped?" I told him a week if he could get me the materials. The materials arrived in 4 days. We spent 2 days preparing the cap, pouring a concrete and timber plug into the upper shaft that would prevent any further access to the workings below. I supervised this work personally, remaining above ground for all of it. Before the cap was set, I descended one final time alone, at night, to the midpoint of the upper drift. I carried no tools. I carried only my field book and a lamp. I did not speak. I stood in the drift for several minutes in the warmth that came up from the deep sections, and I listened. What I heard was the breathing rhythm, very faint at this distance, cycling slowly through its long intervals. I had the strong sense, as I had had on the night of October 13th, none of something enormously patient, something for whom my entire life was a brief and minor event in a sequence of events measured in spans of time that I lacked the mathematics to express. I did not find this comforting. I did not find it terrifying either, not by that point. I found it clarifying in the way that certain vast and undeniable facts are clarifying. The mountain had been there before any of us. It would be there after all of us. Whatever was in its deep interior had its own relationship to time and space and human presence that had nothing to do with our schedules and our production targets and our wages and our lives. I turned off my lamp for 30 seconds before I left. I wanted to stand in the absolute dark of the mountain with the breathing and the warmth and feel the full fact of what it was. And it is not something I can fully translate into language that makes sense in the light. But I stood in it and I accepted it. And then I turned my lamp back on and walked out of the mountain for the last time. The shaft was capped on October 22nd, 1911. The official documentation cited structural instability in the lower formation as the cause for the suspension of operations. No mention was made in any official record of the acoustic phenomena, the missing workers' probable fate, the stone arrangement at the Crosscut 2 working face, or the communication I had experienced during my solo descents. The missing persons reports for Hassel, Vane, and Dacio cited probable accident in unlit areas of the workings. Their families were notified and compensatory payments were arranged. Whether any of the families were fully satisfied with the official account, I cannot say. I suspect they were not. But there was no alternative account available to them, and the alternative account would not have given them anything more useful than the official version in terms of understanding what had happened to their men. Charles Aldgate left the site on October 23rd. Before he left, he took both my logs, the official one and the second one, and carried them with him to Reno. He told me the company would retain them for internal reference. I do not know what became of the official log. I have strong reason to believe the second log was destroyed. I had anticipated this possibility and had made a careful summary of the second log's key entries in a third notebook that I had kept in my personal trunk rather than in the site office. Now, this third notebook is what I have been working from for the account I am now giving. I left the Harlan No. 1 site on October 28, 1911, with the last of the departing crew. Roland Pruitt shook my hand before we parted ways at the Lovelock rail station. He did not say much. He was not a man who said much. He said, "You made the right call and I'm glad to be leaving." I told him the same. We went our separate ways, and I did not see Pruitt again until a chance encounter at a Denver mining conference in 1924, by which point we were both older men with settled lives, and we greeted each other warmly and did not discuss Harlan No. 1 at all. I spent the following years working in mining operations across Nevada, Colorado, and Arizona. So I was good at my work and I advanced in my position, and I built a life that had nothing in it that resembled the events of October 1911, except in the hours before sleep, when the mind goes where it wants to go and cannot always be directed away from the places it returns to. I married in 1914. I had 2 children. I was by most measures a contented man, but I thought about the Harlan mine with regularity throughout my life, not obsessively, not in any way that interfered with my functioning, but steadily, the way you think about something that has permanently altered your understanding of a basic fact about the world. The basic fact it had altered for me was the fact of depth. Not the depth of rock exactly, though that was part of it. The depth of presence, the depth of inhabitation, and I'd been underground many hundreds of times in my working life before Harlan No. 1. And I'd understood the underground as an environment to be worked, a physical space with physical properties, empty of anything except ore and rock, and the men who descended to extract what was valuable. After Harlan, I understood the underground differently. Not every tunnel, not every shaft, not every foot of rock. But I understood that the underground is not uniformly empty of presence. It is old enough and deep enough and sufficiently removed from human time to have developed, in some places, something that is not life as we understand life, but is nonetheless a form of persistence, of accumulated awareness, of something that waits and listens and eventually responds. I passed the Humboldt Range several times in later years, traveling the route between Reno and Winnemucca for various professional reasons. The capped shaft at the Harlan No. 1 site would have been invisible from the road by then, overgrown and eroded and indistinguishable from the ordinary surface of the terrain. I never stopped to look for it. I had no desire to stand near the ground above those tunnels, not out of fear exactly, though fear was part of it, more out of respect. The kind of respect you give to a thing that has made its nature clearly known to you and asked, with great patience and in the only language available to it, that you leave. I left. I've spent a long time deciding how to end this account, and I have not found an ending that satisfies me fully, because the events at Harlan No. 1 did not end in a way that produces narrative closure. The mine was capped. The thing in the tunnels continued. 3 men who should have lived out their lives did not. The company records tell a story that is not the true story, and I am an old man dictating to a device in a room in Elko, Nevada, trying to put into plain language something that resisted plain language from the beginning. What I will say is this: there are places in the earth that are not empty, not in the way that horror stories or ghost tales mean when they say places are not empty. I mean it the way a geologist means it when he says a formation is not simple, meaning that it has a history that precedes any human contact with it, and that this history is present in the physical fact of the place, legible to those who know how to read it. What was in the Harlan #1 mine had a history that preceded any human mining in Nevada. It had a history that preceded any human presence in that part of the world. It had adapted to the occasional intrusion of human beings the way a very old and very large animal adapts to the occasional presence of smaller animals near its territory. With patience, with observation, with a willingness to respond when approached, but no particular urgency about doing so. It was not malevolent in any way I could clearly identify. Malevolence requires a moral framework, and I am not able to say whether this thing had a moral framework. What it had was territory and the patience to defend it, and the accumulated intelligence of something that has been listening for long enough to understand the language of what it hears. I told you at the beginning that I was not a superstitious man. I am still not. Superstition is the attribution of human agency and human emotion to things that are not human. What was in the Harlan #1 mine was not human, and I'm not attributing human qualities to it. I'm saying only that it was present and that it was aware, and that it communicated in the only way available to it, and that it made clear, in a language assembled from our own voices, that the deep places of the mountain were not ours to enter. We had the good sense eventually to listen. The mountain is still there. The cap is still in place, as far as I know. The formation is still warm at depth, assuming the geothermal properties have not changed significantly in 50 years, and there is no particular reason they would have. What is down there is still down there. It is waiting as it has always waited, for with a patience that makes human patience look like an infant's. It is warm in the deep rock, and it is listening as it has always listened to the world above it, and occasionally, when something descends close enough, it responds. I do not recommend descending. I have carried the names of the 3 men with me for 53 years, Frank Hassel, Arthur Vane, Carl Deschio. They were working men who went into the dark to earn wages and did not come back, and the official story of their fate is false, and the true story of their fate is what I have given you here, imperfect and insufficient as it is. They went into the deep workings of the Harlan #1 mine, and they went too far, and what was in the deep rock received them, and they became part of it. She settled into the warmth and the depth and the vast, incomprehensible patience of what waits inside the old mountains. I do not know if this is a terrible fate, or a transcendent one. I have been trying to decide for 53 years, and I have not arrived at an answer. I know only that when I stand near old mountains now, near the very old formations of the basin and range, the volcanic upthrusts and the ancient sedimentary layers, I feel the awareness of what is underneath them the way you feel. A temperature change as a physical fact rather than an imagined one. It comes up through the rock the way warmth comes up through rock. It is not malicious, it is not benevolent, it is simply there, as it has always been there, waiting with the kind of patience that only very old and very deep things possess. For the next set of voices to descend close enough to hear. I hope the voices it hears next are wiser than ours were. I hope they listen when it tells them to go back,